I want to welcome Dr. David Mackay, our next speaker. David is a plant ecologist at the University of New England. He's the vegetation theme leader in the UNE Freshwater Ecology Group, researching terrestrial vegetation responses to water flows in the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. I won't mention his co-authors. You can talk about your co-authors.
I'll mention that.
Yep. So he's going to talk to us about wetland wildfire. Post-wildfire inundation is critical to maintaining a water couch, Paspalum distichum marsh wetland community. Thanks, David.
So now that I've said I'm going to acknowledge those other authors, I should do that first. These are other members of our freshwater ecology team at the University of New England, where I work. We work in the Guida Wetlands, west of Moree, where this study was conducted. We also work in the Warrego Wetlands at Toowoomba State Conservation Area, which is west of Bourke. And there are slight differences, but one of the differences is that the water couch marsh wetland community that I'm talking about today is only here in the Guida. It's got another stronghold in the Macquarie marshes, but not at Toowoomba, west of Bourke. As well as acknowledging those authors, I'd like to acknowledge the Kamilaroi elders who have cared for the country and water, the area where we did this work, west of Moree. And they probably, in fact I'm sure they do, have lots of advice about fires, and we're only just starting to understand the impacts of fires. There's very little knowledge really about fires in wetlands in Australia. I'm seeing more research coming out from the Pantanal in Brazil, and particularly regarding the increased frequency of fires that they're observing there, and how that is having quite a large detrimental impact on the wetland ecology of the Pantanal. We had several communities that were burnt here. Most of what you can see there is the dried off remains of tall taifa or Kambunji rushlands, and that's where most of the fire was concentrated. It also escaped outside that into a lot of these water couch marshlands, and to a lesser extent into the Coolabah woodlands, which are further out from the waterways. But I'll explain some of the reasons why we decided to concentrate this study on the water couch marshlands. But first of all, I'd just like to offer a couple of caveats. Like most, if not more than 99% of fire studies, this was an opportunistic study. It wasn't, an experimental one. So, some of the planning is a bit ad hoc. And part of the problem with that is you often don't actually have plots before the fire and after the fire. In this case, we did thankfully have some permanent plots set up before the fire. We've been working in this area for about 5 years before this fire occurred. So we've got before and after the fire information, and we've now been following it. This fire was part of the mega fires that happened in 2019. So we've been following this now to last year, and we're about to go out to the site again on Sunday to do this year's surveys. A bit more context. So this was taken last year, and you can see how lush it is now compared to what it was in 2019 during the drought. The tall rushland in the background is the taifa rushland that I referred to, and I'll talk a little bit later on about that, how it is actually encroaching into the water couch marshland, and that is one of the reasons we're concentrating some of our thoughts on what is going on in the water couch marshlands. Another thing about these water couch marshlands is that work by other members in our team on invertebrates, freshwater invertebrates, and water quality, they're showing that the biodiversity in these marshlands is far higher than you're seeing in the taifa rushlands, particularly in terms of aquatic invertebrates. And that's one reason that you get a lot more birds foraging in there, but obviously you can look at it and see it's a much more amenable habitat for birds to forage in than to try and push through all the taifa to find any food. This is one of the primary strongholds for water cooch, as I mentioned earlier, and we need to understand better. At the moment, part of the reason that we're working in these areas in the Murray-Darling Basin is that farmers, and these areas are just surrounded by cotton farms, farmers can tell you, if I get this many megalitres of water, I can produce this much cotton. At the moment, we can't say the same thing about the environment, unfortunately, and that's what we're trying to quantify and get a better idea of. If we get this much environmental water, which is obviously controversial in the Murray-Darling Basin, we're going to see these benefits in the natural environment. So that's what we're working towards. The aims of this study, having seen this fire and thinking, okay, we should do some sort of work on the fire, was to try and determine what the impacts of the fire were on this community, and also try and tease out the differences between the fire impacts and the inundation impacts that followed on from that. So this fire was in late 2019, and then in early 2020, of course, the drought-breaking rains came. These sites were inundated again. So trying to work out what were the fire impacts and what are the inundation impacts can be tricky, but we're trying to do that in this study. So this is part of a larger study, but the focus here, again, is on the impacts on this particular water cooch marshland. And you can see in that there's a lot of, it's dominated by water cooch, Paspalum distichum. It's also got things like Juncus persicarias, Nardoo, almost all sort of aquatics, some terrestrial damp species, but mostly aquatics. So taking a first look just at species richness in our permanent plots, so the permanent plots are 20 by 20 metres. We had 6 sites, and because it's an observational study and an opportunistic study, we had 5 burnt sites but only 1 unburnt site. But because we know so little about what happens with fires in these wetlands, we thought it was still worth going ahead. The fire with that red arrow going down, that happened in September 2019. We had this data before that in 2018. There was an environmental water flow with the black arrows just before that survey we conducted in 2018. And there is no statistical difference, thankfully, between the various plots and between the plots that then became burnt and the plot that remained unburnt. So we're off to a good start. 2 months after the fire, we did the first survey of those sites. Again, there was no difference between those plots, but you can see after the inundation came in March in 2020, you started getting a surge of species richness in the burnt plots. So that looked really interesting. Of course, we did see an increase in the unburnt plots as well. These wetlands, the plants have a boom and bust characteristic where they respond really well to inundation. They rely on inundation. But this sort of difference between the burnt and unburnt plots is something we didn't really expect. So that's really exciting. And then the next survey in spring of 2020, you could see the species richness in the burnt plots had gone even higher. And then it came back down. You got further incidents of inundation, and particularly in 21 and 22, those inundations just lasted for months and months. And so we ended up with most of the plots were actually submerged with just a few plant species poking up above the water surface. But by 2023, you can see that the burnt plots and unburnt plot were again the same as each other, in terms of species richness at least. But in terms of dissimilarity, we just wanted to look a bit further, particularly because of that surge in species richness. Thankfully, once again, Bray-Curtis dissimilarity, there was no significant difference between the burnt and unburnt plots. Again, good start. After the fire, no difference again. Much higher dissimilarity among the plots, but they're all still the same, there's no difference. Well, a slight significant difference because there's only one plot, one site that was unburnt. I take that with a grain of salt. But that spring where we saw the really large difference in species richness, there was a very large and significant difference between the burnt plot and the unburnt plots. And as with the species richness, that then returned. But after the inundation, November 23, where you'll remember that the species richnesses had returned to be the same, there was in fact a significant difference between the burnt and the unburnt plots, which suggests here that that fire impact does in fact last a fairly long time, 4 years at least here. So it'll be interesting to see if those differences still exist now. The obvious question with that surge in species richness, were all those species just exotics that were taking advantage of the fire ground, or were there a whole lot of natives? Thanks. In the unburnt site, there were 4 new native species, which we typically expect to see after inundation. This was in the spring, the year after the fire. In the burnt sites, there were 24 new native species, but also 15 exotics. So the suggestion is that we're possibly getting a turnover of the seed bank of native species. Probably a lot of them were also blown in, and possibly the same thing was happening with exotics. Just looking at the exotics, we then tried to break down what were the important factors influencing species richness in the exotic species. And the first thing that this is a redundancy analysis, the first thing that pulled out as the most important factor was time since the previous inundation, which you'd sort of expect in this sort of wetland community reliant on inundation. And if those numbers in between the circles are the numbers in days, so that sort of threshold, time since inundation, if it's more than 466 days, then you've got quite a high species richness in the exotics, lower if it's less than that. Next important thing, inundation duration. We know that inundation duration can be used for controlling some of these weeds, such as Lipia, which is one of the ones we get in this wetland. So it's not surprising, once again, less than 15 days, then you get more weeds. More than 15 days, you get less. Then time since fire finally comes in as an important factor, and time since drought, I put that in as well because of the recent drought. If that's more than 487 days, then that's when you get the least number of weeds. So you can expect that number of weeds in your communities to gradually decline, as we see here. We did a seed bank study as well, where we grew up soil samples from the various plots. And we found very little difference between burnt and unburnt plots, between wetted, where we just kept the soil wet, or inundated, where we kept them submerged. But the most important finding was this one at the bottom, average rainfall treatment, where we gave them the equivalent of the average rainfall, it's about 1 millimetre a day. We applied that every 3 days, so the equivalent of 3 mils a day, 3 mils every 3 days. There were far fewer germinants, less than half, than in the other ones, and none of those seedlings were able to get established. So maybe fire's a good thing, as with all things, yeah, but as I mentioned before, in the Pantanal, they've been looking at how fire frequency is increasing, and that's proving to be extremely detrimental, to the extent that you're seeing papers like this now, where how long would there be life at all in these environments. And one thing that's also impinging on this is, in the last couple of decades at least, rainfall is declining, particularly late autumn and late winter in these areas. Droughts are becoming more frequent, more intense. Fires are potentially going to become more frequent in these wetlands. And of course, we're seeing more ongoing land clearing for agriculture in the area. But just looking at Paspalum distichum, this checkerboard that looks a bit like a tea towel in the middle of that first bar, it was extensive when we started off. It declined gradually during the drought to almost being disappeared. But soon after the drought had broken, it came back. Not as strongly as before, and that's a concern. But another concern is the fact that Typha came back even stronger. And that remains a real problem. Some of our other sites where we're looking, Typha has actually taken over. And some of the other more resilient species, such as Eleocharis, have taken over as well, and the Persicaria is disappearing. One thing we think may be using the trigger that we've got at our hand, which is extending or restricting the duration of some of these floods, is that Paspalum distichum cover gradually goes down as the duration of inundation increases, whereas Typha goes up. So perhaps we can use that as a management tool. And we're doing further study on that. So I'd like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to thank all of you for lasting the distance. That's the last talk. Thank you.